In part one, I cut the threads in the large block of Corian to make the faceplate. What I'm doing is you can use a commercial faceplate and then create the Frugal vacuum chuck, and that's what the instructions gear you towards. But I turned my own faceplates and I made them out of Corian. But I actually incorporated the faceplate and the vacuum chuck all into one piece. I used large glued up blocks of Corian to make this happen. I did this for the 2.5 inch that you see me holding here, and I'll do that in the 5-inch piece that I worked on to cut the threads in the last video. So come along and let's knock the rest of this out. Okay, so this is the spindle shoulder right here. It's got 2 steps to it. This back step is 1.25 inches, and it fits perfectly in this non-threaded part that you can see right there. And it butts up against it without effort. So you get a nice tight joint at the shoulder of the spindle in the back. I could even, once I get this turned, if I wanted to, I could drill and tap a hole for a lock nut, or a grub screw as some call them, or an Allen screw. I probably will not, because that's the only reason. You really only need that if you're going to do a reverse turning on something, and with a vacuum chuck I'm not going to be doing any reverse. What I want to do now is measure the diameter here and take this parting tool and cut a groove that this will fit in. I will take my dividers. Let's try it there. Before I do that, I want to face this off if it needs it. So I'll go through the same process that I did a while ago. Boy, that is close enough for the girls I run with. Before I get too deep, so I want to go in. The instructions tell you to make a groove 3/8 of an inch deep. I will probably go between 1/4 and 3/8. Okay, now it's right. I don't know what I know. So, put this there. Okay, now it's square. That won't stay in on its own. So I had to have a cheater. And it sits nice, it doesn't rock. So this part's done, with one exception. I will take this over to my oscillating spindle sander. I'll take this to my oscillating spindle sander, and I will sand those corners to the line and round this up. So when I get that done, I'll go on to the next step. Now, because I'm using Corian, I'm not following the instructions exactly, but close enough. I'm at the point now where I want to drill the hole that's going to accept the sealed bearing. You got 2 holes to drill, one for the bearing and the through hole. You don't want the bearing hole to go all the way through. You want it to seat. So first thing I'm going to do is take this piece, which fits inside here, and I'm just going to make sure it's nice and round and smooth, and it will be glued on top of this with the bearing and hose running through it. So this will sit in here like this, and this piece right here will sit in here on top of that with the bearing in it. I'm just using a friction drive. I've marked the center. It's really, really close. I want to make sure this is nice and round before I shove it down the drill. Okay, it seats nicely. That will be epoxied as well. When I seat this fully down in here, I can push that down against it. So that's perfect. Make it close enough to see. Yep, it does. Okay. Now the seal bearing is 7/8 inches in diameter. So you want to use a 7/8 inch drill bit. And you only want to drill deep enough to seat the bearing, and it says that's 9/32 of an inch. I made a mark on the back of my chuck that gives me that dimension. So what I'm going to do, it says then take a 3/4 inch Forstner bit, which is smaller than this, and drill a through hole. So I'm going to drill the through hole and begin test fitting without hitting the jaws. That was through. I went a little too deep. Dad blasted. But I'm going to epoxy this in anyway. And to make sure that it doesn't come loose or back out, I'm going to put a couple of screws in it. I'm not too worried about if the epoxy's going to hold it. Pretty much all that's left is the assembly. So this is what it's going to look like, except for adding the pad, and I'll be truing this up before I do that as well. So now we'll get over to the bench and I'll start gluing everything together. But before we do any gluing, I need to drill the pilot holes for these screws. So let's get over to the bench. I drilled my 2 pilot holes, and they send some washer-headed screws to use with this, but the Corian is a little bit tough, so I'm going to use some self-tapping sheet metal screws that are roughly the same thread, and I'm going to start the threads with those. You want to position the screw holes so that the edges of the screws just cover the edge of the bearing, but you don't want it to interfere with the nut. Now I want to mix up a tiny bit of epoxy so that I can just fill the inside of that hole where the bearing goes. You don't want to use too much. You don't want any excess. You want to make sure that you get the epoxy all the way around the perimeter, but you don't want it to go down into the other hole. You just want a little bit, just enough to cover the bearing so that you get a good seal without it flowing up on top of the bearing. The instructions say after you get the epoxy applied, put the bearing in and then take it back out to make sure you've got epoxy all the way around the perimeter of the bearing so that you get a really good seal. And then you put it back in. But you also want to make sure you're not getting any excess epoxy in the bearing. And you want to make sure that the hex head nut clears all of the screws so that it spins nice and free. Now you want to set that piece aside in a safe place while you mix up a fair amount of epoxy, because I want to epoxy this into here and this onto here. So now I'm going to take this and set it on here and move it around so that I get a nice seal and a coat of epoxy all the way around. Here I'm just trying to make sure that I work out any air bubbles. And I do the same thing with the collar, making sure I work out any air bubbles. Now I know my table saw is level, so I'm going to mix up some more epoxy and I'm going to put it along the perimeter on the inside and around the outside so that I get a good seal all the way around. I want to make sure that I don't have any air leaks. I'm going to apply the epoxy with the point of this bamboo skewer. Now we're at the point where we have to let this sit and cure overnight before we can take it over to the lathe and make sure this is running nice and true. I say that a lot. All right, I've got this on here. The glue's dried. It's been on here overnight, and it looks really good. I don't see any gaps at all in the epoxy, and it's actually quite true. And I'll do the rest in sandpaper. And I'm using sandpaper to give it some bite for the spray adhesive. Now I'm going to do one more thing before I put the closed cell foam. I've already got it cut. But before I put it on, this is kind of blocky, and I don't want it blocky. So I'm going to try to round it up some. Getting there slowly but surely. Okay, it's looking a lot less blocky now. I'm not going to take it down anymore. I'm happy with that just the way it is. Okay, I'm blowing that off because I'm going to spray it. Now I'll wait 5 minutes or so and I'll glue that on. I'm going to cut this hole out. I need to cut that off too. So I'm going to cut this hole out right there. Razor knife wasn't as sharp as it's supposed to be, but that's okay, because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap this over on the inside. And get it nice and glued down. And I'll do the same thing out here. Now it's glued down all the way around. Now, if the time comes that I need to replace this, it's easy. I just peel it off and glue another piece on. It's just closed cell craft foam. I got a package of it from Walmart for a few bucks. I got like 6 different colors. So there we have a relatively true vacuum chuck. There's really not any wobble in it. And it works equally well on both lathes. So both vacuum chucks are done. Now it's time to wire and plumb my vacuum pump. I've had this for a few years and it never had any cord on it. So I'm going to get this all soldered up and put a switch in line, and then I can add the fittings. Well, I got my vacuum pump and manifold of sorts mounted to a board, and I've got one line run over to my 2014 and the small chuck, and as you can see, it works just fine. I would never spin it this fast with a vacuum on it, but you can. It'll spin. This chuck's true. Runs nice. You can see there's no run out. So now, let's turn the vacuum pump on and see what happens. Okay, the vacuum pump is on. As you can see, it's pulling about 7 inches of mercury, and that's with it open. Now watch the gauge. I'm going to put my finger over the hole in the chuck, and you see it immediately drops down to 18 or 19. The biggest draw I've ever been able to get on it so far testing it is 19 inches of mercury. So I don't know if that's going to be strong enough. I'm hoping it is. We'll just have to wait and see. That little vacuum pump is not one of the strongest you can buy. Okay, I built this vacuum chuck and vacuum system for the express purpose of being able to buff things like this out or rub them out. It's a lacquer finish and I need to buff it up. I've got this running fairly true right here, and I will be able to buff this out. So, only drawback is that once I turn it off, you can see the vacuum releases real slowly, and that could be a good thing. It would give me time to put whatever I've got in my hands down and grab hold of the piece. But right now, it's still stuck. Now it'll come off. But with it under 19 inches of mercury, there's no way I could pull this off. I tried. I couldn't budge it. So that kind of worries me a little bit, maybe thinking that 19 psi may be a little strong. I might, if the bottom is very thin on whatever I'm trying to chuck, it might crush it or pull it in. Acid test works. All systems are go. And because of the slow bleed off, that leads me to one more thing that I may want to do. I may want to come in and put a T right here with another ball valve out here so that I can release the pressure, just in case. I don't know, I'm still thinking that through, but I may well add a T here and another ball valve just to release into the atmosphere. That may be a good idea. And I've got it sitting over here by my big boy. so the hose won't have to be too awful long, but I'm going to have it long enough to hit both lathes. So there's that.